Anita Sanctuary, this is fantastic. I have read what you have given to me, which is typical Anita Sanctuary, multiple pages, extremely detailed, leaving nothing to chance, especially to me. And so one of the things that struck me is that you sort of focused in on your experiences and said you were that the experiences had reinforced ideas taught by my parents: respect people from different backgrounds and beliefs and accept their differences. Tell me about your parents.
My father was a businessman in town. He had a farm machinery store, and he was a partner with his brother in the hardware store, and he had a farm outside of town where we lived.
Where was town?
Town was Greenville, New York. It was a population of about 500 people. I went to the same high school, or the same school, from grade 1 through grade 12, and graduated with 56 kids. And it was a wonderful, out of the movies, wonderful way to grow up. Very wholesome. Small, tiny South Street with Methodist Church at the base and insurance company at the other end, and up street, which was Main Street, was just a few little storefronts. There was a grocery store, a pharmacy, hardware store, restaurant, 2 restaurants, a hair salon, tiny, oh, and a little department store. That was it. That was it. And it was just an ideal way to grow up.
Talk about your mother.
My mother was, grew up in the boarding house business, and after she married my dad, she decided that it would be a wonderful, perfect connection for her to start a smaller version of what she had grown up with, which was a small boarding house. So my parents purchased a 3-story Victorian home, converted it to rooms with private bath, converted the carriage house to 9 rooms with private bath, put in a swimming pool, croquet, badminton, shuffleboard, just little tiny things to take up the people's time. She came to Greenville, New York at age 20 after graduating from Albany Teachers College, and she taught first junior high English and then 4th grade, 2 years, and on which time my dad rescued her. She said, I was rescued from the classroom. And she told all 4 of us daughters, try to find something other than education. It's really tough. And all 4 of us became teachers. So that was my mom and dad.
What about you? You get out of high school, graduate from high school in Greenville?
Yes.
Then where?
Class of 56 kids, 1961. And I went to Penn State University for 2 years. It was a wrong connection. Too big, too impersonal. I can remember the class sizes were enormous. Even classes by TV Monitor. It was one of the first TV Monitor class settings. Totally intimidating for someone from a town of 500 people. So I decided to make a change, and a friend of mine suggested the University of Denver. I'd never seen the University of Denver. I'd never been on the campus. I didn't know anything about it. But to me, this was an out. And so I transferred to the University of Denver for my junior and senior year and had my first plane ride out to Denver. And there I was with my 2 suitcases. And it was the best decision I ever made. It's where I met Dave, and we stayed in Colorado for decades. before life took us to Houston. And then from Houston, we ended up back in Chautauqua County.
Which was Dave, was a native of Chautauqua County?
Yes, yes. His father grew up here as a child, met his mother, who was a dental hygienist, and he was the dentist, and they married 1940 and came to Jamestown to start a practice. And Dave grew up here, right on North Main Street, where North Main and West Oak Hill split. That's now the Tim Hortons restaurant. That property used to be the setting of a beautiful Tudor home, and that's where he grew up. But as other businesses enveloped that property, it was time to sell and make it commercial. Sadly.
Dr. Gordon and Eleanor Sanctuary.
That's correct.
And Eleanor, for those for the camera, would know her well during the WCA hospital auction.
She was president of the board for years, and it was her life. She did all kinds of fundraising and meeting after meeting, and put on the wing, one of the wings of the hospital. She was dedicated to the hospital. She was also dedicated to her card group, bridge group. She loved bridge, but she also enjoyed her leadership in the community.
Which was at Moonbrook, where they.
It was at Moonbrook, yes, it was. And she also enjoyed her work with both of Dave's parents, with the Roger Tory Peterson Institute.
Very active. When you come back, you retire, you stumble onto a guy named John Sember. Tell me the scene.
Okay, John Sember. I had met him a couple of times in different settings when Dave and I would come back to Jamestown. And after we moved here, there was a party, and John was there, and we were doing little skits and games and so forth. And he said, you know, with your teaching background, he said, I think it would be a great connection for you to be involved with the Robert H. Jackson Center. Do you know who Robert H. Jackson was? I knew that there was a statue of Robert H. Jackson outside of a school that I had passed, but that was about what my knowledge of Robert H. Jackson was. But I was about to learn of who Robert H. Jackson was and why he was important to local, state, national, and international law. It's an incredible story. And I'm very grateful that John Sember suggested that I become involved with the Jackson Center.
As are we. John Sember was brought into the fold really through a relationship he had with Raleigh Kidder.
Okay.
And so, John, did he bring you into the education committee first? Is that how you...
Yes. He was a member of the education committee, and he invited me to come to the meetings, and I did. I met several great people there. Kathy Crocker Evans was one of the members, and John, I can't remember the beginning members, and then as I stayed, others joined, and some left and some came. But I do remember those two as being key people.
It was quite a few of a rotation, but John clearly was he together with Raleigh would not only would think about events, law day, saging, S-A-G-I-N-G. They created a saging where we would have an event at the Jackson Center and bring in people to talk about the lake and other related, and bring in speakers. And John and Raleigh would muse about these things and make it happen. That's one thing about the Jackson Center. people who think about it, ultimately, it does turn into an action item. There's not a lot of pause.
Well, I do remember the mock trial, that he was instrumental in contacting a fourth grade teacher that he knew through his teaching experience. And they had, they were play acting a mock trial based on the Three Little Pigs. And invitation was given to, I can't recall if it was elementary or middle school aged students, but I do remember how absolutely 100% packed that theater was. The kids were not only in the seats, but also seated on the steps, and then a line of chairs, a couple of lines of chairs behind the staging area on the floor. I mean, it was just, there were children everywhere. But once the play started, it was dead silence. And they were a wonderful audience from start to finish. And following that program, we broke into groups and took all of these students on a tour of the Jackson Center. Now, that was in the very beginning stages of the Jackson Center. And there weren't a lot of artifacts or photographs, or there wasn't a lot to see at that point. But it gave them a step one, hopefully to come back another time at a later age and revisit and see all of the wonderful exhibits that are there now.
Do you remember Aaron Beckwith?
Aaron Beckwith was he a film producer? And his film was Follow the Star. And he would come and introduce the film, and again the theater would be packed, and then the film would roll, and the shaky picture and the creaky voice is hard to hear because the film was produced when? I mean, a long time ago.
62.
In 1962. And here is this reel-to-reel being shown on a screen, and the kids, again, end of the school year, packed the theater, and they were just glued to what was going to happen to these people as they marched up and got their freedom across the Canadian line. It was a good story, and it was an award winner. Yes, I remember. Yes, he was one of the beginning players.
Correct. Aaron, one event I remember, because I got to know him through Chautauqua, and that's sort of how this got implemented. But it's an Underground Railroad movie, and he said, by the way, right here in this place is part of the Underground Railroad. Everybody should go down now and look at that. Were you there when chaos reigned among me? My eyes popped out of my head.
Probably I was. I probably was. I know I was there on, I think, 2 of his presentations. But I think we might have been prepared. I think you're talking about the first time that happened.
I looked around, where's the staff, where's anybody? How are we gonna, on a moment's notice, because now the kids are pumped up, man. They want to see the basement, the Underground Railroad. True or not, story true or not, that's what Aaron had announced.
Oh, it was true.
It was true, absolutely.
It was absolutely true. So down we went, down through one section and through the basement and into this room, which was barely a room, and there's this big hole that had been filled in, which was the hiding place, perhaps, definitely the tunnel that went under the street and up into the church, which was, who was the first owner?
Kent's.
The Kents. Mrs. Kent attended that church, and she wanted to be protected from the elements. So there we would be with this big hole that had been filled in, and it could have hid the slaves, and it was impressive. It was an impressive behind the scenes exposure to a possible part of history.
Just for the camera, because I'm not sure I've ever mentioned it, when we bought it, there was a cardboard sign on the entryway going in. It just said, Underground Railroad circa 1858. So when we bought the facility, there was a
Plaque.
nail, and not even a plaque, it was just a cardboard piece of cardboard. I should have kept it. But that was, at least before us, they had touted that as an Underground Railroad aspect.
There was also a sign that had to do with a fallout shelter. And I think air raids, did people seek refuge in the basement of that home? Yeah.
All of that. So a lot of early activity. And then you became the coordinator of the author program. Do you remember how that started?
I do. Actually, it started at Chautauqua Institution with the connection that Barbie Price and Bridget Johnson and you had a connection with Jerry Spinelli. And I don't know how that all worked out, but all of a sudden we found ourselves in a position of approaching him in the possibility, the slim possibility, that he would speak to middle-aged students. It wasn't his favorite activity, if I recall. And he loved the writing part, he loved all of publishing and all of that, but the speaking part was not his favorite activity. So I can remember talking with Kent Brown. Highlights involved, was he publisher? No, what was he?
Publisher, president, owner, he was everything.
Okay.
Big dog.
And Bridget and I talked with him at either a lunch or a dessert that we'd had on the porch of the Athenaeum, and talked about the potential of what could happen with an author situation at the Jackson Center and how valuable that would be for the community. So he, and I don't know if he spoke to Jerry or you spoke to Jerry and Barbie spoke to Jerry and Bridget spoke to Jerry. I think everybody was sort of gently setting a stage for him. Please come and address our students and be a part of this wonderful beginning of the Jackson Center. And he agreed to do that. And it was when I was on the education committee and Raleigh approached me, would I coordinate this program? I was new to the community. I didn't know teachers. I didn't know the names of the schools. I didn't know how big was Chautauqua County. Were they all listed in the phone book? All of it. Computer skills were just, starting to come forth. And so I found myself, yes, I would be happy to coordinate this, but then thinking, where do I start? And it was, number one, get the facts, get the message out by computer to the schools, to the administrators, and one by one we started getting reservations for 650 children. And it was short notice. And for the schools to put aside bus money, ticket money, time, it was a short time that they had to organize that. And it was so impressive that it was so well attended. Now, there was another missing link. This was a new facility to the Jackson Center. It had been used by the Masons. There was no staging. There was nothing there for staging of a speaker, or where was the podium going to be, was there going to be risers, and then when it was a full house, including chairs right up to the speaker, how are we going to get him above those chairs on the floor? Ed Tomasini was magical. He came back, and I remember him looking behind the curtains of the Jackson Center, no, behind the backdrop curtains, where there were piles of things stored. And he pulled out potential risers and steps, and he literally built down on the floor a podium on top of a raised base with steps going up to it. Unfortunately, no railing. So anyway, it all worked out beautifully. But it was Ed, with his staging ability and his media work, that enabled that whole piece to come together. And I'll remember when you came in that door, and you came in and you looked at that stage with the curtains and the screen ready to show the film clips and the massive chairs around a raised podium with steps. You said, I never envisioned this. and it was...
I'm envisioning it now for the first time in a long time. Wow.
So that's what I remember about the first event.
Well, we also had a bonus through Raleigh Kidder's relationship on the World War II Memorial Committee with a lady named Helen Fagan.
Helen Fagan was in her 80s, a beautiful woman who had lived the events of the Holocaust. And she was one of the ones who had been, mistreated. Let me just say it that way. And she came to the Jackson Center and without one note told her story from start to finish without a flaw. And it was direct, it was accurate, it was from her heart and soul, and it was heart-wrenching what she went through. And what she said at one point was that she had come close to death 9 times during this experience. And when you think about that, it wasn't close to death because of being mistreated. I mean, I've had close calls with a car accident or something like that. But she actually, because of someone else's hand, someone else's negative feelings, came close to death because of being persecuted. And I thought, that is something to come through. She came to the United States, in her words, with only her name, and she got an education, not only an education, but a doctorate. She became a teacher at a university in Florida. And I can remember one time Dave and I were driving through Florida, and it was on vacation, and all of a sudden we came on this huge billboard with a picture of Helen Fagan, and it was advertising the Holocaust Museum, and it said something about never forget, or something about some little phrase about never forget. And I thought, how she has put that in her past, yet use it, the information that she lived, in order for others to learn, and became a college professor and passed on all of this firsthand knowledge. And there was something that she said that was particularly interesting to me. She said there were 3 kinds of people behind this Holocaust. One was the victim, one was the perpetrator, and one was the person who looked away and did nothing. And her message basically was, if you see wrong, take steps to correct it.
For the camera, Jerry Spinelli's book title and subject was what?
The title was Milkweed, and it took place in Poland, Warsaw, the Warsaw Ghetto. And it was the story of the survival of the people in the Warsaw Ghetto. And was that the actual setting of where Helen Fagan was interned? I thought so. And so the parallel was perfect. She was telling her story of the reality behind the fictional truth of what was in Jerry Spinelli's story.
Just a vignette. Jerry stayed with us as part of the deal. He didn't like hotels, was not going to fly, he was going to drive, and Jerry, please stay with us. And we've become fast friends. But after the evening when Helen spoke, so Helen spoke the night before, then we quickly adapted, if you recall, Helen into the program with Jerry the next day. So we started with a movie on the Warsaw Ghetto, and then Helen, and then Jerry. That was not how it was originally scripted, but Jerry said, hey, this is unbelievable.
Right.
And in fact, he was intimidated because he had written about something upon research when in fact here is the real deal. Well, she was very impressed, having read his book, on the reality of his book. So the two of them, I'll never forget this, after the first event, they huddled together for lunch, just the two of them, and talking about, what a great time, etc. But the idea, maybe this is a road show.
I remember specifically that. Going to take it on the road. We're going to just, they hit it off very well, and complimented each other in their stories and what they had done. Jerry, in preserving the story to a modern reader, and Helen actually living the situation. One thing that Jerry did bring up to me, there was someone at the table at the lunch who said something about, does he ever write for adults, or does he always write for middle school students? And he said, Milkweed is not for middle school students. It was written for adult readers as well as students. And after that statement, all of the other books that I read them as far as me as an adult versus trying to put myself in reading this as a middle school student. But it was his comment that made me think of it, reading these books with a different perspective.
Just as an aside, recently a large studio bought the screen rights for Milkweed.
Oh.
And you may know that Stargirls, one of his books,
yes,
is on Disney. That's been produced. It's now a full-length movie. So it's remarkable. And it set the tone when we had Jerry and then somebody who was actually lived it. The next year we had Lois Lowry dealing with Number the Stars, and which dealt with Danish resistance. And we had Jim Sorg.
Jim Sorg was connected because of his specific history with the Norwegian people. And it was, he is a local man here. I'm not sure what town he's from, but he is a Norwegian. He has Norwegian heritage, but he is an American citizen because he was born here. And his story involved his mother and Jim going by boat to Norway in order to connect with the grandmother before she passed. Unfortunately, they didn't get there in time. But what was important here was the timing of their trip. because it wasn't very long after when the invasion of Norway happened with the Nazi soldiers, and they were taken over immediately. He wasn't able to get back to the United States. He and his mom could not return. So he was isolated there. His father was back in the United States, and he told of some of the experiences that he had observing what was going on with the Nazis and the citizens. The ripping of people out of their homes, the murder of the underground people found participating in the underground movement, the resistance. And one story I don't know if I even want to repeat, but he was conversing with another child, hand signals through the fencing, and finally the child motioned him to come and handed him a carved piece through the fence. And he took it home and asked his mom if he could return the gift with some bread, and the mom gave him the bread to take back. Do you remember what happened? Mm-hmm. When he returned, he noticed that the child's fingernails had been pulled off. And it was that kind of horror that these people who were, I mean, when you think of a child, that happening to a child, you can imagine what was happening to the adults. These actual stories relayed by the guest speakers who supported the authors made the stories even more real than to read the fiction side of the story.
Jim had really never told that story, and certainly not publicly. So when he was willing to do that, the place was packed, as you remember.
I do.
And Jim's family were there, kind of half of them with jaws on the ground, listening to the story itself. And one of the concluding parts is Jim and his mother, who had been writing letters back home, never hearing back from them, literally coming home and going into New York to be picked up, and there's Dad, and Dad thought they were dead and had remarried. Can you imagine?
No, I can't. No, I can't. And I don't know, I can't understand why communication was non-existent. It's the way it was.
No question censoring. So, and then we had Lois. Lois stayed with us also, and she was fascinating. And Number of the Stars. What did you have any reaction to Lois? Do you remember interacting with her much?
I do. Dave and I picked her up at the airport, and we had a nice conversation. And she met with the librarians, the public school librarians, for a luncheon, and answered their questions and their comments, and then boom, right into the awards ceremony that night, and meanwhile an interview by you. And we don't let those authors have any rest time. And her message had to do with the Danish resistance. And I can remember at the end of her story, she related a personal story, and it was having to do with, this was long after the war had ended, and her son had fallen in love with a German girl and was going to marry, and so Lois invited a friend who remembered too much about the Holocaust to accept the invitation and go to Germany for the wedding. And it was one of those times when I thought of all of the encouraging that the authors and the speakers are doing to encourage us to take the good, move forward. I think of Helen. I think of some of the other speakers. Go forward. Don't look back. Go forward. And yet her friend was unable to forgive and move on.
The next year, 2007, we had Christopher Paul Curtis. Thematically, I think the Education Committee focused in on really the Holocaust and its remembrance and legacy, and the civil rights. There seemed to be two themes that we sort of went back and forth on and did find an appropriate book of that.
It's because that was Jackson's connection. Jackson's connection because of his work at Nuremberg, and therefore the Holocaust and everything that happened that led up to the Nuremberg trial, and also the civil rights work that Jackson did during the Brown versus Board of Education. And so that's why we were pulling things for younger readers that had to do with Jackson's specific work, whether it was Nuremberg or the civil rights movement. And also we wanted to focus on well-known authors, authors that perhaps the middle school teachers would recognize and therefore be anxious to hear in person.
And I think that's normally the Newbery Award is a nice thing to have, and I think a lot of our authors were that.
Exactly. That is the most prestigious award that an author can receive for her work to address a younger audience.
Christopher Paul Curtis's was The Watsons Go to Birmingham, 1963. And as a prelude to that, we had locals who were involved in the Freedom March. Vivian Taylor, who was from Alabama. George Lawn, who actually as a minister went down to as part of the Freedom March, as was Raleigh Kidder, our executive director.
That surprised me, that Raleigh at such a young age had the interest and desire to go down and take part and do what he could, because he understood that this was wrong. And he said, I think I remember him saying, there was possibility of being shot, there was a possibility of being jailed, there was a possibility of this, that, and everything else, and he decided to go. I don't recall what happened then, but it was impressive to me that he decided to go at all.
He was a seminary student at the time and went to Mississippi. Among those people he met was Mickey Swarmer, who subsequently was one of the three who had been killed in Mississippi, which led to the FBI getting involved. So he had a whole personal connect, aside from his own experience. So Raleigh tells that story, and just as a postscript, last year I actually reached out and I got a hold of the widow of Mickey Swarmer.
Oh wow!
Trying to invite her here, and we had several conversations, but ultimately she just didn't want to relive it. She was very active at the time, trying to get that to happen. Christopher Paul Curtis, very much of a presence, big guy. And it was engaging with the students. He
really involved the kids. He had no podium. He just spoke off the top of his head. He spoke as encouraging writing, more so than talking about his book specifically. He wanted these kids to be writers. So that was his mission.
And the next year we went back to the Holocaust concept with Hannah's Suitcase. Karen Levine, who was introduced to me through folks at Chautauqua Institution, who she was as a speaker at Chautauqua's on the book Hannah's Suitcase, and she was staying with Norm and Carp. So they invited me up for a lunch. Hi, how are you? Good to see you. She's essentially not an author. She's a CBC radio announcer. And she agreed to come, and that was the introduction.
Had she written? She hadn't. She had written Hannah's Suitcase by that time.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. I found her online, and when I was researching authors connected with the Holocaust or authors connected with civil rights that I could have for potential next authors. And I had not heard of Karen. I didn't know her story. I didn't know if a Canadian author would be appealing. And we drew 1,250 students. Karen drew 1,250 students for a full house at the Reg Linné Civic Center and a full house at the Jackson Center, and kids were down in the lower level. And she addressed those kids after the program. She went down to talk with them specifically to have a personal time with them before they loaded their buses to go. She was amazing. And she was amazing. And she took everything in stride. And she, again, like Jerry Spinelli, speaking was not her favorite activity, but she knew the importance of her doing it and telling the story, and telling the story of not just Hannah, but Hannah's brother, George Brady, who lived in just terrible guilt his entire life because he felt he hadn't done enough to save his sister. But because Karen wrote the story of Hannah and involved George in putting the pieces together, he found peace in knowing that Hannah's story would continue and she would be a model of
Remember, we almost got George here.
Close. Close.
That was close. But we did have the benefit of Annalise Salomon, who came to us not through the Buffalo Holocaust, but anyway, she was from elsewhere. And she'd either reached out to us, I knew we got a hold of her, but she came at the same time and killed it. I mean, she was just unbelievable speaker.
Again, she told her personal story, which was very upsetting to her. And again, you're reminded of people reliving the horrors and the terrible mistreatment and the torture and how man can do that to another man or woman, how people can do that to people was a learning experience not only for the middle school students, but in doing this several times as I researched for the Jackson Center, it ingrained in my head the importance of justice and fairness throughout the world. And her story was part of that. I remember her, as did Jim Sorg, becoming upset with the film clips that took them back to the reality of the time. There were some black and white film clips that you had put together for Jim Sorg's history, and then also of Annalise, and also of Helen Fagan, and they set the stage for what happened back during those times. And she became upset with that, and she became upset with the song at the end of Karen Levine's program that was a song that was being sung by children about the events, and it went to her heart.
Yeah. No, she was moved, and for all of us, obviously, part of the setup was to put everything in a time and perspective, so that you knew that there was a sense of history. The next 2 years, we were blessed to have the results of the good work that a lot of people did with Kent Brown, of highlights through Jerry Spinelli originally, and really Kent was very much on my radar screen to help identify speakers that were in his orbit, just like Jerry's speakers, just to give us names to kind of cull through. And then having spent, I think, sending highlights authors down when they would meet during the summer to come to the Jackson Center to tour. You probably gave them tours.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe talk a little bit about how that all kind of germinated to Gail being hired.
If I remember correctly, the connection again was with Kent Brown and the highlights and the authors coming, and he was asked, knowing what he knew about Jackson and the Jackson Center, knowing that we wanted a book that was more condensed than Gerhardt's book and on a more readable level, geared for middle school and high school, but also appropriate for adults as well. So that was the mission. And were there any authors that he felt would fit this bill? And Gail Jarrow, because of her work with research, factual things, not so much on the fiction side, but of putting history together and actual facts. And he suggested Gail, and it was a perfect author. She spent 2 years researching and went to Washington and spent hours and days and weeks and months and 2 years of her life just researching and getting a sense of who Jackson was. Why is he important? Why is he important for everybody to remember now, not just during his lifetime? And she was an animated speaker. She was excited for what she was relaying to the kids, and her message was the importance of justice. And who was it that went from country lawyer all the way to Nuremberg prosecutor, chief prosecutor actually, Robert H. Jackson. And she put a beautiful book together.
I remember the timing of her first, well, at least her first visit here. It may have coincided, was with the Big Read, a program that the Prendergast Library in Fredonia had put together, and that Fredonia agreed to actually do a reader's guide on the book.
Okay.
And so there's a teacher's guide and there's a reader's guide that they actually took the book and coincided. And so we had also Harper Lee's book, To Kill a Mockingbird, was the Big Read.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Big Read 2, because we wanted to capture both at the same time, was Jackson. And so Gail came up, and it was just terrific. Then she came the second year, so it was 2 years.
She did, and I think it was the second year that we incorporated the program in Warren.
Yes, that's true.
And so there was an extension of her work down into Warren. That was the first time that happened. So steps and bigger audience and more outreach. And so this little part was beginning to expand. The audiences were bigger, more schools were being involved, we turned to distance learning as another form of outreach when our funding in schools got weak and they couldn't afford the time to come because the state standards had been changed and all of that change. So we changed right along with it, and instead of as many kids coming to the Jackson Center, the outreach went to the schools.
And BOCES became a very strong partner with us.
Oh my. BOCES had two parts for me. One was the broadcasting, and the second was Lisa Wolski with her libraries of books and the amount of support that she gave to the Jackson Center, ordering books that were written by the authors that we were featuring so that teachers could borrow those books directly from BOCES and not have that expense on the shoulders of the schools.
Just for the camera, Mike Beba was very much instrumental with the BOCES distance learning program.
Yes, he came and set up the cameras and tested, and that was a huge jump in a new direction for the Jackson Center to broadcast to other schools. First it was in our county schools, and then it became statewide.
And as part of the state, it's a good time to note that through not only the good program that you were coordinating, but we did reach out to the New York State Bar Association. And an essay contest sort of evolved.
Well, the essay contest actually started with Kathy Evans, and she wrote for the local students. That was the beginning. And then Raleigh, because of his contacts in Albany, got the connection with the Law, Youth, and Citizenship program of the New York State Bar Association. And they became a key player in writing the standard for the statewide writing contest. And so all of a sudden, what was started here in the Jackson Center expanded out to the entire state. And some of the winners came from Long Island and from all over the state. And they were representing their schools proudly. And they were honored at the awards banquet. And the awards banquet was the setting for the actual, the people who had lived the history of the books that had been written.
And that happened, the Law, Youth, and Citizenship group really went on for a long period of time, and in fact, they reached a point where they hired somebody at a significant expense to write standards for teaching Gail Jarrell's book.
Yes, that's true.
And I'm trying to think of the guy's name, but he came a couple of times.
Yes, he did. And I was trying to think of his name as well. Eileen Garish was his cohort,
right,
but I could not come up with his name. We will.
Sorry. Should you see this? After we did the Gail Jarrell for 2 years, then Jane Eolin, The Devil's Arithmetic. Again, another Holocaust moment. What do you remember about Jane?
Jane is an author of adult books, children's books, middle school aged books, poetry, as well as realistic fiction. And her book, The Devil's Arithmetic, is a fantasy which starts in the present, goes back to the past, and returns to the present. And it goes from reality to the Holocaust time and then back to reality. And it's a very interesting story. She she shared some of her rather graphic poetry with her audience, and she joined the cadre of all of the others who preceded her as far as the Holocaust as a topic. The person who accompanied her was Lily Silbeger, and she is another Holocaust survivor who had a heart-wrenching story of being in two different types of camps. One was a work camp where she said the conditions weren't as bad as the other kind of camp, the concentration camp, where the conditions were dreadful. And her story was that toward the end of the war, 1,500 women were gathered in order to march these women. I can't remember the starting point or the ending point, but it was significant. And it was in the wintertime. And they were ill-clothed, and they were without food, and so forth. And at first, if they couldn't keep up, they would be shot. After a while, the people who were leading this march to death were told not to shoot them, but to just wait until they faded. She and a friend made it to the very end of the march, and they were able to escape 4 days before the end of the war. And they made it to a farmer, and the farmer nourished them and gently nourished them back to health. And I don't remember how she came to the United States, but again, it's one of these stories where the survivor with horrific tales makes it all the way to the United States. And she joined a friend in Buffalo. Buffalo was the only place she'd ever heard of in the United States, with nothing. And again, she started, and it's the story of looking forward. Don't look backward, look forward. Remember to make life better. And do what you can to stop wrongdoing. And again, it was one of those stories that went right to your soul.
I remember the interview, and I remember seeing, because I was half looking at her and half looking at her daughter.
Oh.
And her daughter was a wreck. Because she was hearing things that apparently either had not been articulated the way, and I think, wow, I don't know, hopefully I don't know what nerve I was touching, but hopefully it was a good nerve.
And you know, that's another example of someone who, when faced with viewing the past with your black and white film clips, she was visibly upset and had to gather herself before she could speak. And when she spoke and told the truth about what had happened, again you think, how ever could 6 million people have died in this? How many buffaloes is that?
Yeah, lots.
Lots of buffaloes. I think of Buffalo, New York, and the population of Buffalo, and I imagine 20 cities, all of them populated with 100% Jewish population, annihilated.
There you go.
So.
Then we went back to civil rights the next year. Philip Hoos, I think that's how you pronounce it.
Hoos.
That's okay. A little known story, in fact, about Claudia Colvin.
Yes. Everybody knows the name Rosa Parks, but not very many people know Claudette Colvin. And his book was a true story of what happened prior to the Rosa Parks sitting on the bus, refusing to go out of the white section, the quote white section. And she was she was educated, she was an adult, and she was selected to be a model in the mission of the civil rights movement. Years before, when Claudette had done the same thing, she was met with being yanked off the bus and mistreated and thrown into jail with no representation. And she was young, she was 15 or 16, and it was a very sad story about what happened to her unfairly. It just is brings to light a piece of history that we weren't aware of, and honoring her as a strong voice against something that was very wrong.
We did get a chance, we tried to bring her here, too. The timing just wouldn't work out, but we did get a piece, a vignette video that we did show
That's
beforehand.
true. Yes.
To again put her into civil rights perspective. Philip also was related to, for you New York Yankee fans listening to this tape, Don Larson, who pitched the perfect game, the only perfect game in the history of the World Series. So when Paul Lombardo and I had a chance to interview Phil before the event, we didn't talk about Claudette at all. We just talked about baseball. That's on YouTube for those folks who want to see that. Your last one on the list here was bringing back Karen. Why would you bring back Karen?
Because she had been a very successful author in her presentation and in the responses from the teachers and the students, and it was 5 years since she had been here, and we felt that a new audience would now have come up from elementary into middle school, and that her message was equally important to these new people, the new audience, as it was 5 years prior. And she agreed to come, and it was it was a full house at the Jackson Center both times at that time, and very well received.
And she had a reprinted book out. I mean, as I recall, it was a updated sort of version of that, and just classic all the way around. And then you sort of decided you'd pass the mantle off to Paul Lombardo.
It was Paul's turn, and Paul was always interested in the author programs. I can remember him and one of the other teachers from his school. I don't know who covered his classes, but he and she came and sat up in the little tiny, what do you call that little tiny section with two chairs in it?
Yeah.
Just so that he could get a feel for what this author program might be all about for the future, for his students and for his school and for people that he knew in education. And so that was the beginning of his involvement with the Jackson Center. So he scooted right in and was very comfortable in taking over when I retired my position as event coordinator for the author program.
What a run.
It was a wonderful experience for me. I worried that I was going to make mistakes with the reservations that were coming through on my computer. I was afraid my computer might crash sometime and I'd lose all of the information, and I learned a lot, particularly from the people who actually lived either the civil rights time or the Holocaust years. I learned so much from their personal stories. I also learned a lot from the authors themselves. So for me, it was a win. I won.
So did the Jackson Center. We're still living it now, your legacy of the Anita Sanctuary. So thank you. It's fantastic.
It has been a wonderful experience. Thank you for having me.